Hey, settle in, get comfortable. Maybe dim those lights, let the world outside fade a little. Tonight, we're not talking about knights or plagues or distant queens. Tonight, we're going back further, way further, to a time when Rome wasn't an empire. Wasn't even a city, really, just 7 hills covered in mud, timber, and the dreams of people who had absolutely no idea they were about to build the greatest architectural legacy the world had ever seen. Before you think about marble columns and massive domes, before the Colosseum and the aqueducts, there was this, a settlement of huts, literal huts, circular, cramped and constructed from whatever the land offered, which wasn't much. So close your eyes for a moment. Picture it. The year is roughly 750 BCE. You're standing on the Palatine Hill, one of those 7 famous hills. But there's nothing famous about it yet. It's just dirt, rocks, and a collection of primitive shelters that look like they'd blow over in a strong wind. Welcome to the founding of Rome. It's not impressive, not yet. The earliest Romans didn't have grand blueprints or master architects. They had mud, straw, timber, and stubbornness. Their homes were simple, circular or oval huts with walls made of wattle and daub, a fancy term for sticks woven together and covered in mud. The roof, thatched, meaning bundles of reeds or straw piled up and prayed over. When it rained, and it did rain, the interior became a swamp. When it was hot, the structure baked like an oven, trapping the smell of smoke, sweat, and whatever livestock was living inside with you. Because yes, you shared your hut. With your family, with your goats, with insects that considered you a long-term host. The floor was packed earth. No tiles, no stone, just dirt that turned to mud when wet and dust when dry. You slept on animal hides if you were lucky, directly on the ground if you weren't. Furniture was minimal, maybe a wooden bench, a storage pit dug into the floor, a hearth in the center for cooking and warmth. That hearth, by the way, had no chimney. Smoke just kind of hung around, filled the hut, stung your eyes, coated your lungs. But it also kept insects away and preserved the thatch, so you learned to live with it. You learned to live with a lot of things. These huts were small. We're talking maybe 10 to 15 feet in diameter. Cozy is one word for it. Suffocating is another. Privacy didn't exist. Personal space was a future concept. You woke up, worked, ate, slept, and repeated, all within a radius that wouldn't fit a modern studio apartment. And here's the thing, this wasn't temporary. This was Roman architecture for generations, centuries even. While the Egyptians were building pyramids and the Greeks were experimenting with stone temples, early Romans were still patching up mud huts and hoping the roof held through winter. But let's not dismiss them too quickly. Because even in these humble structures, something important was happening. The Romans were learning. They were learning how to work with what they had, how to adapt, how to take the landscape, the climate, the materials at hand, and turn them into shelter. It wasn't elegant, but it was functional. And function, not beauty, was the Roman way, at least at first. The placement of these huts wasn't random either. They clustered on hilltops for defense. The Palatine, the Capitoline, the Quirinal, each hill offered a vantage point, a place to see enemies coming. Because enemies were always coming. Rival tribes, bandits, neighboring settlements. Early Rome was constantly at war, constantly defending itself. So the huts were grouped together, tight, almost overlapping. Narrow paths wound between them, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. There were no streets, no urban planning. Just organic growth, chaotic and cramped. And in the center of these clusters, open spaces. Not parks, not plazas. These were communal areas where people gathered, traded, argued, and sacrificed to the gods. Because even in a settlement of mud huts, religion mattered. The gods had to be appeased. Spirits had to be honored. Small shrines began to appear. Nothing grand, just a pile of stones, maybe a wooden post, a spot where offerings were left. Bread, wine, the blood of a slaughtered animal. The Romans believed the land itself was sacred, filled with divine forces that could help or harm. This belief would never leave them. Even when Rome became a city of marble and gold, even when emperors built temples that touched the sky, the Romans never forgot the gods were watching. And architecture, all architecture, was a conversation with the divine. Now, let's talk about what these early Romans didn't have. No concrete. No arches. No vaults. No domes. None of the innovations that would later define Roman engineering. What they did have was wood, lots of it. The hills around Rome were forested, and timber became the primary building material. Wooden posts supported the hut roofs. Wooden beams framed doorways. Wooden planks, when they could afford them, reinforced walls. But wood had problems. It rotted. It burned. And in a settlement where every hut had an open fire burning inside, fires were common. Catastrophic even. One spark, one gust of wind, and an entire neighborhood could go up in flames. The Romans learned this the hard way, again and again. Entire sections of early Rome burned to the ground, forcing families to rebuild from scratch. But each time they rebuilt, they learned. They adjusted. They began spacing huts farther apart. They dug fire breaks. They started using stone for foundations, even if the walls were still mud and timber. Stone was expensive, hard to quarry, hard to transport, hard to work. But it didn't burn. And it didn't rot. So slowly, painfully slowly, stone began creeping into Roman construction. First, just the foundation, a ring of stones set into the earth to keep the wooden posts from sinking into mud. Then, stones for doorways, providing stability and a bit of grandeur. Then, for the wealthiest families, stone walls. Not tall ones, not impressive ones. Just enough to say, we're not like the others. This was the beginning. The first whisper of what Rome would become. A people who started in mud but refused to stay there. Life in these early settlements was brutal. Short, unforgiving. Most people didn't live past 40. Disease was rampant. Sanitation was non-existent. Waste was tossed into the streets, if you could call them streets. Water came from the Tiber River, which also served as a sewer, a dumping ground, and a place where animals drank. But here's what's wild. Even in this primitive state, even surrounded by filth and chaos, the Romans were ambitious. They looked at their mud huts and thought, this isn't enough. They didn't just want to survive. They wanted to build, to expand, to dominate, and they were willing to do whatever it took. Other tribes in the region, the Etruscans to the north, the Greeks to the south, were already building in stone. They had temples, city walls, organized streets. The Romans saw this, and they were jealous, envious, determined. They began trading with the Etruscans, learning their techniques. They hired Etruscan craftsmen who brought knowledge of stonemasonry, drainage systems, and urban planning. The Romans absorbed it all, copied it, improved it, made it their own. This wasn't theft. It was adaptation. The Roman way. Take what works, discard what doesn't, and build something better. And so, slowly, Rome began to change. The mud huts remained, but around them, new structures started to rise. Wooden temples with stone foundations, meeting halls with tiled roofs, defensive walls made of rough-cut stone, protecting the growing settlement from invasion. Rome was no longer just a collection of huts. It was becoming something else, something more. By the end of the 6th century BCE, Rome had a king. Well, several kings, actually, though history remembers them hazily, shrouded in myth and propaganda. The last of these kings, Tarquin the Proud, commissioned the first major public work, the Cloaca Maxima, the Great Sewer. Yes, Rome's first architectural achievement was a sewer, not a palace, not a temple, a drainage system. Because the Forum, the low-lying valley between the hills, was a swamp, unusable, foul-smelling, breeding ground for disease. If Rome wanted to grow, that swamp had to go. So they dug, by hand, with bronze tools and raw labor. They carved channels through the earth, lined them with stone, and created a massive drainage system that funneled water and waste into the Tiber. It worked. The Forum dried out. And suddenly, Rome had a public space. A place where people could gather, trade, debate, and build. the heart of the city was born. And the Cloaca Maxima, it still exists, still functions. Over 2,500 years later, that's Roman engineering. Built to last. Built to outlive empires. So here we are. Rome in its infancy, a place of mud, timber, and ambition. The huts are still standing, the fires still burning, the people still struggling, but something has shifted. The Romans have tasted possibility. They've seen what stone can do. They've learned that water can be controlled, that land can be shaped, that architecture isn't just shelter, it's power. They don't know it yet, but they're standing at the edge of something monumental. In a few generations, they'll invent concrete. They'll master the arch. They'll build structures so massive, so enduring, that people 2,000 years later will still visit them, still marvel at them, still wonder how, but for now, they're just people in huts, dreaming in mud, building in wood, refusing to accept that this is all they'll ever be. And that refusal, that stubborn, relentless refusal to stay small, that's the foundation of everything that comes next. So take a breath. Let that image settle. Rome, barely a city, just 7 hills, a drained swamp, and a people who looked at nothing and decided to build everything. Next, we'll watch them take their first real steps. We'll see stone replace mud. We'll see temples rise. We'll see the birth of Roman architecture as the world would come to know it. But tonight, remember this, every empire starts somewhere, and Rome started in the dirt. You're still on those 7 hills, but something's changed. The year is around 600 BCE, and Rome is no longer just a cluster of mud huts clinging to hilltops. It's transforming. Slowly, painfully, but undeniably, the Etruscans have arrived. Not with armies, though they could have conquered Rome easily. No, they came as kings, craftsmen, engineers. They brought knowledge. And the Romans, proud as they were, swallowed that pride and learned, because the Etruscans knew how to build in stone. They knew how to drain swamps, pave roads, and construct temples that didn't collapse after the first heavy rain. They had cities with walls, with organization, with permanence. And Rome? Rome was still figuring out how to keep a thatched roof from leaking. So tonight, we're watching Rome's awkward adolescence, the moment when timber starts giving way to stone. When the first real temples rise, when architecture stops being about survival and starts becoming a statement. But here's the thing about learning from others, you don't just copy. You absorb, adapt, and eventually you surpass. The Romans were about to do exactly that. Let's watch it happen. The first Roman temples weren't Roman at all, not really. They were Etruscan designs built by Etruscan hands on Roman soil. The most important of these was the Temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, Jupiter best and greatest, built on the Capitoline Hill around 509 BCE. This wasn't just a temple, it was a declaration. A cosmic anchor point, the holiest site in Rome. Picture it, a massive rectangular platform raised high above the ground, built from blocks of tufa, a soft volcanic stone quarried from nearby hills. The temple sat on top, towering over the forum below, visible from every approach to the city. 3 rooms inside, called Celi. 1 for Jupiter, king of the gods. 1 for Juno, his wife and queen of heaven. 1 for Minerva, goddess of wisdom and war. The divine trinity, watching over Rome's destiny. The roof was unlike anything Rome had seen before. Made of terracotta tiles, brightly painted in reds, yellows, and blues. And along the roofline, statues, not stone but terracotta. Life-sized figures of gods, warriors, and mythical beasts staring down at the city below. The entrance faced south toward the forum. 6 massive wooden columns held up the porch, each one carved and painted to mimic stone. Because actual stone columns, too expensive, too difficult to work. So they faked it, painted wood looking like marble. And no one cared, because from a distance it looked magnificent, imposing, divine. This was the Roman way, make it look powerful, even if you're still learning how to make it actually powerful. But let's talk about what went into building this temple, because it wasn't just Etruscan knowledge. It was Roman sweat, blood, and bodies. The tufa blocks each weighed hundreds of pounds. Quarried from the hills outside Rome, they had to be cut, shaped, and dragged into the city. No wheels on the carts, those weren't common yet. Just wooden sledges pulled by oxen and slaves. Slaves. Let's not skip past that. Roman architecture, from day one, was built on forced labor. Prisoners of war, conquered peoples, the poor sold into bondage. They hauled the stone. They dug the foundations. They mixed the mortar. They did the dangerous, back-breaking work that no free Roman wanted to touch. And they died. Regularly. A block slips, a rope snaps, a scaffold collapses, and another body is dragged away. No safety regulations. No compensation. Just another casualty in the name of progress. The foundations for the Temple of Jupiter were dug deep into the Capitoline bedrock. Workers hacked through layers of volcanic rock with bronze tools, creating a platform so massive it could support the weight of the structure above and the weight of history it would carry. Drainage channels were carved beneath it, leading into the Cloaca Maxima, because even temples needed plumbing. Even the gods required their sacred spaces to stay dry. Once the platform was complete, construction began in earnest. Wooden scaffolding rose around the site, lashed together with rope and hope. Workers climbed ladders carrying terracotta tiles, buckets of mortar, carved wooden beams. Accidents were frequent, falls were common, but the work didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Because this temple wasn't just a building, it was a promise. A statement to the gods and to Rome's enemies: we are here. We are permanent. We will not be ignored. The temple's design followed Etruscan principles, but with Roman modifications. Etruscan temples were raised on high platforms, podiums that elevated them above the mundane world. The Romans loved this. Height meant power. Visibility meant authority. But Roman temples also had deep porches, colonnaded front areas where citizens could gather, where priests could perform public rituals, where the line between sacred and civic blurred. The Greeks built temples as houses for the gods, closed off and mysterious. The Romans built temples as stages, open and accessible, where religion was a public performance. Inside those three cella, statues of the gods stood watch. Not marble yet. Rome didn't have skilled marble sculptors. These were terracotta or wood, painted and gilded to shine like gold. Jupiter sat on a throne, lightning bolt in hand, his face painted red with cinnabar, a ceremonial color that signified divine power. Offerings piled at his feet. Bread, wine, fruits, incense, and on special occasions, blood. Animal sacrifices performed on altars outside the temple, the smoke rising toward the heavens, carrying prayers and promises. This was Roman religion, transactional, public, and deeply tied to the state. You didn't worship the gods out of love. You worshipped them to secure favor, to guarantee victory, to prevent disaster. Religion and politics were inseparable. The temple wasn't just sacred space, it was the heart of Roman power. Now, let's step back from the Capitoline and look at the rest of Rome, because while the Temple of Jupiter dominated the skyline, the city below was still a chaotic mess. The Forum, freshly drained by the Cloaca Maxima, was beginning to take shape as a public gathering space, but it wasn't paved yet. Just packed earth, muddy when it rained, dusty when it didn't. Wooden shops and stalls lined the edges, selling everything from grain to bronze tools to questionable meat. Streets, if you can call them that, were narrow dirt paths winding between buildings. No grid system, no urban planning. Just organic growth, twisting and turning based on whoever built first and wherever they felt like putting their house. Most Romans still lived in timber and mud structures. Single-story homes with thatched roofs, packed tightly together, separated by alleys barely wide enough for a cart. Fire remained a constant threat. One spark, one careless moment, and entire blocks went up in flames. But the wealthier families, the patricians who controlled Rome's politics and priests, were beginning to build differently. Stone foundations, tiled roofs. Homes with multiple rooms, atriums open to the sky where rainwater collected in a central pool. These houses, called domus, were status symbols. The atrium wasn't just functional, it was theatrical. A space where clients and visitors entered, where the family's wealth and taste were on display. The more elaborate your atrium, the more powerful you appeared. But even these homes were modest compared to what would come later. No marble floors yet. No frescoed walls. Just plastered surfaces painted in simple reds and yellows, decorated with geometric patterns. Rome was still learning, still experimenting, still figuring out what it wanted to be. And then there were the walls. Because Rome, growing and ambitious, was also terrified. Surrounded by hostile tribes, Etruscans to the north, Latins to the south, Sabines to the east, Rome needed defences. The natural hills provided some protection, but not enough. So they built the Servian Wall, named after King Servius Tullius, though it was likely constructed after his reign. This was Rome's first real fortification. A massive circuit of tufa blocks encircling the city, stretching for miles, rising over 30 feet in some places. The blocks weren't perfectly cut. They were rough, irregular, fitted together like a massive stone puzzle. No mortar held them in place, just gravity and careful placement. This technique, called ashlar masonry, was labour-intensive but effective. The wall could withstand battering rams, sieges, and the passage of time. Building it required thousands of workers. Entire sections of forest were cleared to create space. Quarries were expanded. Roads were carved to transport the stone. And the labour force, slaves, conscripts, and citizens forced into service during times of emergency. The wall had gates, heavily guarded entry points where trade goods entered and armies departed. The gates weren't just functional. They were symbolic. Crossing through them meant entering Rome, entering civilization, entering a world governed by Roman law and Roman gods. And beyond the walls, chaos, wilderness, enemies. The Servian Wall wasn't just a defense, it was a psychological barrier. It told the world, inside these walls, we are Rome. Outside, you are nothing. But walls and temples weren't enough. Rome needed infrastructure, it needed roads. The first Roman roads were barely roads at all, just dirt paths, worn down by foot traffic and cart wheels, turning into rivers of mud during rain. But the Etruscans had shown the Romans something better, paved roads. Roman engineers began experimenting. They dug trenches, filled them with layers of stone, large rocks at the bottom, smaller gravel on top, and then paved the surface with flat stones fitted tightly together. These early roads weren't extensive. Just short stretches connecting the Forum to nearby temples and gates, but they were transformative. Carts moved faster. Trade increased, and Rome realized something crucial. Roads weren't just pathways. They were power. Control the roads, and you control movement. Control movement, and you control commerce, communication, and military deployment. This insight would define Roman strategy for centuries. But in 500 BCE, they were just figuring it out, one stone at a time. Meanwhile, religion continued to shape architecture. Small shrines popped up across the city, dedicated to household gods, neighborhood spirits, and deified ancestors. These weren't grand temples. Just simple altars, niches carved into walls, small roofed structures protecting sacred flames. The Romans believed the world was alive with divinity. Every spring, every tree, every crossroads had its spirit, and those spirits demanded recognition, offerings, respect. So architecture became devotional. Every public building included a shrine. Every home had a lararium, a small altar where the family's protective gods resided. Architecture wasn't secular. It was sacred, infused with the divine at every level. This mindset never left them. Even at the height of empire, even when building monumental structures that celebrated human achievement, the Romans never forgot the gods were watching. And architecture was a conversation with forces far greater than stone and mortar. By the end of the 6th century BCE, Rome had been transformed. It wasn't a collection of mud huts anymore. It was a city, rough, unpolished, still learning, but undeniably a city. The Temple of Jupiter stood on the Capitoline, its painted roof gleaming in the sun. The Forum bustled with trade and politics. The Servian Wall encircled the 7 hills, protecting the growing population, and the Cloaca Maxima flowed beneath it all, carrying away the filth and making urban life possible. The Etruscans had taught the Romans well, but Rome was no longer just a student. It was beginning to develop its own voice, its own style, its own ambitions. In the next century, Rome would overthrow its kings and establish the Republic. And with that political transformation would come architectural evolution. Temples would grow larger. Public spaces would become grander, and the Romans would begin to see architecture not just as shelter or symbol, but as a tool of empire. But tonight, let's pause here. On the edge of transformation. In a city built from stone and ambition, where every block laid was a step towards something no one could yet imagine. Rome had learned to build. Now it was about to learn to conquer. Take a breath. We've moved forward in time. It's 509 BCE and everything has changed. Rome just did something radical, something that would echo through history. They threw out their last king, Tarquin the Proud, and declared themselves a republic. No more monarchs. No more divine rulers. Instead, elected magistrates, a senate of wealthy landowners, and a system of checks and balances designed to prevent any one man from holding too much power. In theory, at least. But here's what matters for us tonight. Political revolution meant architectural revolution. Because architecture isn't just about buildings. It's about power. About who gets to build, what gets built, and where. And in the early Republic, everyone who mattered wanted their name carved in stone. Welcome to the age of competition, where temples became trophies, where public works were political statements, and where Roman architecture stopped imitating and started innovating. Let's watch it unfold. The early Republic was chaotic. Wealthy families, called patricians, controlled almost everything: land, money, political office, and religious authority. The common people, the plebeians, had almost nothing, and this tension, this constant struggle between haves and have-nots, shaped how Rome built itself. Patricians used architecture as propaganda. If you won a military victory, you built a temple. If you wanted political influence, you sponsored a public work. If you needed to remind everyone of your family's greatness, you erected a monument with your name plastered across it in letters so large the illiterate could appreciate them. Architecture became a weapon in the class war, and the battlefield was the Forum. By 500 BCE, the Forum Romanum had evolved from a drained swamp into the civic heart of Rome. It was still unpaved, just packed dirt, but it was surrounded by important structures: temples, shops, the Senate House, and speaking platforms where politicians addressed the crowds. This was where laws were debated, where trials were held, where elections were won or lost, and increasingly where buildings shouted louder than words. One of the first major Republican temples was the Temple of Saturn, built around 498 BCE at the western end of the Forum. Saturn was the god of agriculture and wealth, and his temple served a very practical purpose. It housed the state treasury. Yes, Rome's money lived in a temple, because mixing religion and finance wasn't just acceptable, it was expected. The gods protected your wealth, and your wealth honored the gods. Simple. The temple sat on a high podium, as all Roman temples did, with a deep front porch supported by columns. These weren't wooden anymore. They were stone, carved from tufa, still rough but undeniably permanent. And here's where things get interesting. The Romans started experimenting with column styles. Let's talk about columns. Because if you're going to understand Roman architecture, you need to understand the obsession with columns. The Greeks had already perfected 3 orders: Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian, each with distinct proportions and decorative elements. The Romans saw these and thought, we'll take all 3, and we'll use them however we want. Greek architects were purists. Doric for strength, Ionic for elegance, Corinthian for grandeur. Each had rules, proportions, sacred ratios. You didn't mix them. You didn't improvise. The Romans, they mixed everything. They stacked different orders on top of each other. They added decorative elements that had no structural purpose. They took Greek refinement and added Roman pragmatism. If it looks impressive, use it. Early Republican temples primarily used a modified version of the Greek Doric order. Thick columns, simple capitals, the decorative tops, and a sturdy, grounded appearance. These columns weren't just holding up roofs. They were making statements. We are strong, we are stable, we are here to stay. But the Romans quickly realized something the Greeks hadn't fully explored. Columns didn't have to hold anything up to be useful. They could be purely decorative. You could attach them to walls, making flat surfaces look three-dimensional. You could place them in rows just to create rhythm and grandeur. This innovation, using columns as decoration rather than just structure, would define Roman architecture for centuries. It wasn't about function. It was about effect. As the Republic matured, temples multiplied. Every major military victory brought a new temple. Defeat the Volsci, build a temple to Castor and Pollux, the divine twins who supposedly appeared on the battlefield to ensure Roman victory. The temple of Castor and Pollux, built around 484 BCE, sat prominently in the Forum. Its 3 surviving columns, still standing today, over 2,500 years later, are among the most iconic remnants of ancient Rome. But back then, the temple was complete: a tall podium, a colonnaded porch, a single cellar housing statues of the twins on horseback. It became a meeting place for the Senate, a backdrop for political speeches, and a symbol of divine favor. Because that's what these temples were really about, proving the gods were on Rome's side. Every victory, every expansion, every conquered territory was evidence of divine approval, and temples made that approval visible, permanent, undeniable. Defeated tribes, build a temple. Won a civil dispute, build a temple. Survived a plague, build a temple. The skyline of Rome became a catalogue of divine intervention and political ambition. But let's step inside one of these temples, because the exterior was only half the story. Roman temples were dark inside, deliberately so, small windows, if any. The only light came from the doorway and from oil lamps flickering in bronze stands. The cellar, the inner chamber, housed the cult statue, a representation of the god, often life-sized or larger, painted in vibrant colours and adorned with real clothing, jewellery, and offerings. These statues weren't meant to be realistic. They were meant to be powerful, larger than life. Eyes wide, gazes fixed, expressions eternally stern or serene, depending on the deity. Priests controlled access. You didn't just wander into a temple. Entry was restricted, ritualized, earned through offerings or special occasions. The temple wasn't a place of personal reflection. It was a transactional space where priests mediated between mortals and gods. Outside, altars stood in the open air. This is where sacrifices happened. Animals, sheep, pigs, bulls, were brought forward, their throats cut, their blood drained into vessels or poured onto the altar. The smell of burning flesh filled the forum as priests read omens from the smoking entrails. To modern sensibilities, it's brutal. But to the Romans, it was essential. The gods demanded blood, and in return, they granted favor. It was a business arrangement. Clear, practical. Roman. Now, while temples dominated religious life, another type of structure was quietly reshaping Rome, the basilica. The first basilicas appeared in the early Republic, around 184 BCE, though the form evolved from earlier covered markets and meeting halls. The Basilica Porcia, built by Cato the Elder, was essentially a large rectangular hall with a roof supported by columns, open on the sides, designed for commerce and legal proceedings. Think of it as a covered forum. A place where business could happen regardless of weather, where legal disputes could be heard without rain interrupting testimony, where merchants could display goods protected from the elements. The design was simple but effective, a long central nave flanked by side aisles with columns separating the spaces. The roof was timber, supported by wooden trusses. No vaults yet, no domes. Just straightforward post and lintel construction scaled up to massive size. Basilicas weren't sacred, they were civic. And that distinction mattered. In a republic where power was theoretically shared, where public business was conducted publicly, basilicas became stages for Roman life. Lawyers argued cases, magistrates heard complaints, money changers set up tables, crowds gathered to watch trials, gossip, or escape the midday heat. Basilicas were social hubs, legal centers, and economic engines all wrapped into one architectural form. And centuries later, when Christianity rose, this secular design would be adapted for churches. The basilica, born in the Forum for Commerce and Law, would become the blueprint for cathedrals across Europe. But in 200 BCE, no one saw that coming. They were just trying to stay dry while arguing about grain prices. Let's talk about what held all this together: mortar. Early Roman mortar was simple, lime mixed with sand and water. It hardened into a cement-like substance that bonded stones together, filling gaps and adding stability. But here's the problem: it wasn't very strong. It crumbled under pressure, it dissolved in water. And it required constant maintenance. Roman engineers knew this, and they were frustrated by it. They watched Greek structures held together by precision cutting and gravity alone and thought, there has to be a better way. They started experimenting, mixing different types of sand, adding crushed pottery which contained silicates that improved bonding, testing volcanic ash from deposits near modern-day Naples. And then they discovered something remarkable: pozzolana. Pozzolana was volcanic ash, rich in silica and alumina, that when mixed with lime created a mortar far superior to anything used before. It was stronger, it set faster, and most importantly, it hardened underwater. This discovery, sometime around 200 BCE, changed everything, because now the Romans could build in places previously impossible: harbours, aqueducts, bridge foundations submerged in rivers. Pozzolana mortar was the secret ingredient. The breakthrough, the innovation that separated Roman engineering from everyone else. But it wasn't called concrete yet. That term, that understanding of what they'd created, came later. For now, it was just better mortar. And it was about to enable structures no one had imagined possible. Roads were expanding. The Via Appia, built starting in 312 BCE, stretched from Rome south toward Capua, eventually reaching the coast. It was Rome's first great highway, and it was an engineering marvel. The road wasn't just paved stones. It was layered, carefully constructed in stages to ensure durability. First, workers dug a trench several feet deep, removing soft soil. Then they filled it with large stones, creating a stable foundation. On top of that, a layer of smaller rocks and gravel compacted tightly. Then sand mixed with lime mortar. And finally, the surface. Large, flat paving stones fitted so precisely you couldn't slide a knife blade between them. The road was cambered, slightly arched in the center, so rainwater drained into ditches on either side. Milestones marked distances. Way stations offered rest for travelers. And it was straight. Ruthlessly, obsessively straight. Roman surveyors used tools called gromas, essentially perpendicular cross-staffs, to sight lines across the landscape. If a hill was in the way, they cut through it. If a valley blocked the path, they filled it. Obstacles were problems to be solved, not reasons to deviate. This philosophy, straight lines, direct routes, no compromise, defined Roman engineering. Efficiency over elegance. Function over form. Get from point A to point B as fast as possible and build it so well it lasts 1,000 years. The Via Appia wasn't just a road. It was a declaration. Rome's reach extends beyond its walls. Trade, armies, information, all moved along these stone arteries, connecting the capital to its growing territories. Control the roads, control the empire. The Romans understood this instinctively, and they built accordingly. But back in Rome itself, housing was becoming a problem. The city was growing fast. Too fast. Wealthy families expanded their domus, adding rooms, courtyards, gardens, but the poor had nowhere to go. The city walls were fixed. Space was limited. So people built upward. The first insulae, multi-story apartment buildings, began appearing in the 3rd century BCE. These weren't comfortable. They were cramped, poorly constructed, and perpetually on the verge of collapse or combustion. An insula was typically 4 to 6 stories tall, made of wood and brick, with shops on the ground floor and apartments stacked above. The higher you lived, the cheaper the rent and the more dangerous your existence. No elevators, just narrow staircases, often external, made of wood. No running water above the first floor. You carried it up in buckets or bought it from water cellars. No toilets, just chamber pots emptied out windows with a shouted warning that no one heeded. Fires were constant. Cooking required open flames. Heating required braziers. One mistake, one knocked-over lamp, and the entire building went up. And because insulae were packed together, separated by alleyways barely wide enough to walk through, fires spread quickly. Collapse was common too. Builders cut corners, using cheap materials, skipping foundations, overloading upper floors. Tenants woke to cracking beams and tilting walls. Sometimes they got out in time. Often they didn't. Living in an insula was a gamble. But for most Romans, it was the only option. The city was growing vertically because it couldn't grow horizontally. And this vertical expansion, chaotic and dangerous as it was, set the template for urban density that would define Rome for centuries. By 200 BCE, Rome had transformed yet again. The Republic was expanding. Territories were being conquered. Wealth was pouring in. And with that wealth came ambition. Temples grew larger. Public buildings grew grander. The Forum was finally being paved, with travertine and tufa slabs replacing the packed earth. Engineers were experimenting with arches, curved structures that distributed weight differently than simple post and lintel construction. Early arches were tentative, used in gateways and drainage tunnels, but the potential was obvious. An arch could span greater distances with less material. It could support more weight. And it could be beautiful, a perfect semicircle rising from solid foundations. The Romans didn't invent the arch. The Etruscans and others used them first. But the Romans saw its potential and ran with it. Within a century, arches would be everywhere, and they would enable structures that redefined what architecture could do. But that's ahead of us. For now, in the early Republic, Rome was still finding its voice, still learning. Still absorbing influences from Greece, Etruria, and its conquered territories. The city was a laboratory, every building an experiment, every temple a test, every road a lesson. And the Romans were learning fast. Soon, they wouldn't just build. They would dominate. They would create an architectural language so powerful, so enduring, that it would outlive the empire itself. But tonight, rest here, in a republic still young, in a city still growing. In a moment before concrete, before empire, before the world learned to tremble at the name, Rome. Breathe in. We're moving forward again. It's the 2nd century BCE, and Rome is no longer just a regional power. It's becoming something else. Something larger. Something that doesn't have a name yet, but will soon be called an empire. Carthage has been destroyed. Greece has been conquered. Spain, North Africa, Asia Minor, all falling under Roman control. And with each conquest comes something more valuable than gold, knowledge. Greek architects, Egyptian engineers, Carthaginian builders, all bringing their secrets, their techniques, their centuries of accumulated wisdom. And the Romans, they absorbed it all, took what worked, discarded what didn't, and created something entirely new. Tonight, we're watching the birth of Rome's greatest innovation. Not the sword, not the legion, not even the law. Concrete. The material that would let Rome build higher, span further, and create structures that defied every rule of architecture that came before. Let's see how it happened. Remember pozzolana, that volcanic ash the Romans discovered around 200 BCE? They'd been using it for mortar, mixing it with lime to create stronger bonds between stones. But sometime in the 2nd century BCE, a Roman engineer, name lost to history like so many, had an idea. What if we used less stone and more mortar? What if the mortar itself became the structure? They started experimenting, mixing pozzolana with lime, adding water, and pouring it into wooden frames. Adding aggregate, broken stones, pottery shards, rubble, to give it body and reduce cost. And they discovered something remarkable. The mixture hardened into a solid mass, stronger than brick, more versatile than stone. And it could be shaped into any form imaginable. This was concrete. Roman concrete, and it was about to change everything. The chemistry was accidental genius. Pozzolana contained aluminum silicates that reacted with lime in the presence of water, creating calcium silicate hydrates, a crystalline structure that bonded aggregate into a monolithic whole. The Romans didn't understand the chemistry, they just knew it worked. It set underwater, it got stronger over time, not weaker. And most importantly, it was cheap. Stone had to be quarried, transported, cut, and fitted by skilled masons. Concrete, you could make it on site. Use local materials, pour it into molds. And unskilled labourers, slaves mostly, could do the work. This wasn't just an innovation. It was a revolution. The first major concrete structure was the Porticus Aemilia, built around 193 BCE. It was a massive warehouse complex along the Tiber River, designed to store grain and goods flowing into Rome from across the Mediterranean. The building was enormous, over 1,500 feet long, nearly 200 feet wide. And it was built almost entirely from concrete. Massive concrete vaults, curved ceilings that spanned the interior without needing internal columns. This was new. Revolutionary. Before concrete, spanning large spaces required either forests of columns or expensive stone vaulting that only the wealthiest could afford. Concrete vaults were different. Pour the concrete into wooden formwork, temporary molds shaped like arches. Let it harden. Remove the wood. And you had a permanent self-supporting ceiling. The Porticus Aemilia had dozens of these vaults, parallel rows stretching the length of the building. Walking inside felt like entering the ribcage of some massive stone creature. Light filtered through high windows, illuminating mountains of grain sacks and amphorae filled with wine, oil, and garum, fermented fish sauce, Rome's favorite condiment. This wasn't beautiful architecture. It was functional. Brutal, even. Exposed concrete, rough surfaces, no decoration, but it worked. It held millions of pounds of goods. It kept Rome fed, and it proved concrete could be used at scale. Engineers took notice. If you could build warehouses with concrete, what else was possible? Let's talk about arches, because concrete and arches together created something greater than either alone. An arch is a curved structure that spans an opening, a doorway, a window, a bridge. The curve distributes weight down and outward to supports on either side, called abutments. Unlike a flat lintel, a horizontal beam spanning two columns, an arch can support far more weight. Because the stones or concrete in an arch are compressed together, locked in place by gravity and geometry. The Etruscans used arches. So did the Greeks, though rarely. But the Romans saw their potential and became obsessed. Early Roman arches were made from stone. Wedge-shaped blocks called voussoirs, cut precisely and fitted together. The central stone, the keystone, locked everything in place. Once it was set, the arch was self-supporting. But stone arches were expensive. Each voussoir had to be custom cut. The formwork had to support immense weight during construction. And if your measurements were off by even a fraction, the whole thing collapsed. Concrete changed this. You could pour concrete into a wooden mold shaped like an arch. No custom cutting, no precision masonry. Just formwork, concrete, and patience. And concrete arches could be bigger, wider, taller, because concrete, unlike stone, is a single monolithic structure. No joints to weaken, no seams to crack. The Romans started building arches everywhere. In aqueducts, spanning valleys, in bridges, crossing rivers, in buildings, creating doorways and windows. And soon, stacking arches on top of each other, creating arcades, rows of repeated arches that became Rome's signature architectural element. By 100 BCE, Roman engineers were experimenting with vaults. Not just simple barrel vaults, long tunnel-like arches, but more complex forms. The groin vault, two barrel vaults intersecting at right angles, creating a ceiling that rose in four curved sections, meeting at a central point. This was stronger than a single vault and allowed for larger windows where the vaults intersected. Groin vaults required more sophisticated formwork. You had to support the concrete as it hardened in two directions simultaneously. But the result was worth it, a ceiling that looked impossibly light, that seemed to float above the space below. Vaults had another advantage, fire resistance. Remember those wooden-roofed insulae constantly burning down? Concrete vaults didn't burn. They cracked under extreme heat, yes, but they didn't fuel fires. They contained them. Slowly, important public buildings started using vaulted concrete ceilings instead of timber roofs. Temples, basilicas, bath complexes, The skyline of Rome was changing. Less wood, more stone, less temporary, more permanent. Now let's talk about what made all this possible: slave labor. Roman construction sites were brutal places. Thousands of workers hauling stone, mixing concrete, building formwork, pouring endless loads of mortar and aggregate. Most weren't Roman citizens. They were slaves, prisoners of war from conquered territories, people who had no choice, no rights, no names recorded in history. They worked in conditions we'd consider criminal today. No safety equipment, no breaks beyond what was physically necessary, no compensation beyond basic food and shelter. Falls killed workers regularly. Scaffolding collapsed. Formwork gave way under the weight of wet concrete. Ropes snapped, sending stones plummeting. Bodies were pulled from the rubble and replaced without ceremony. The concrete itself was dangerous. Lime, a key ingredient, is caustic. It burned skin on contact. Workers mixing concrete with bare hands developed chemical burns that never fully healed. Respiratory problems from inhaling dust were common. Life expectancy on construction sites was measured in years, not decades. But Rome didn't care. Labor was cheap. Conquered peoples were expendable, and the structures being built were more important than the people building them. This is the dark side of Roman architectural achievement. Every monument, every temple, every aqueduct was built on suffering. The concrete that made Rome great was mixed with blood. We can marvel at Roman engineering, but we can't forget what it cost. Speaking of aqueducts, let's talk about the Aqua Marcia, completed in 144 BCE. It was Rome's longest aqueduct yet, stretching over 56 miles from springs in the Anio Valley to the city. Most of that length was underground. Tunnels carved through bedrock, lined with waterproof concrete to prevent leakage. The water flowed by gravity alone, following a gradient so slight, just a few inches per mile, that it required extraordinary precision to maintain. But for the final approach to Rome, the aqueduct had to cross valleys, and that meant arches. Lots of them. The Aqua Marcia's arcade, a series of arches supporting the water channel, rose over 90 feet in places. Multiple tiers of arches stacked on top of each other, growing narrower as they climbed. From a distance, it looked delicate, almost fragile, but up close, the engineering was brutal. Massive concrete piers, each one sunk deep into bedrock, arches spanning 20 feet or more. And on top, the spicus, the water channel, a concrete trough lined with waterproof mortar. Water flowed through this channel at walking pace, smooth and constant. No pumps, no machinery, just gravity and Roman engineering. The aqueduct delivered millions of gallons daily, enough to supply public fountains, bath complexes, and wealthy homes. Clean water pulled from distant springs, bypassing the polluted Tiber entirely. This was infrastructure as power. Control the water, control the city. And Rome was learning to control water like no civilization before it. But let's return to the city itself, because while engineers were building aqueducts in the countryside, the urban landscape was transforming. The Forum Romanum was fully paved now. Travertine slabs, a harder, whiter stone than tufa, covered the ground. Buildings lined every side: temples, basilicas, shops, monuments. The Basilica Sempronia, built in 169 BCE, was one of the largest covered spaces in Rome. Its interior was a forest of columns supporting a timber roof. Legal proceedings, business deals, and political speeches happened simultaneously under one roof, a cacophony of Roman public life. But timber roofs were still a problem. Fire was an ever-present threat, and engineers were beginning to imagine something different. What if basilicas had concrete vaults instead? The technology wasn't quite there yet. Spanning the width of a basilica, 60 feet or more, with a single vault was beyond current capabilities. The formwork would collapse. The weight would be immense. But they were close. They could feel it. The pieces were coming together. Concrete, arches, vaults. All that was needed was someone bold enough to push the limits. That moment was coming, sooner than anyone realized. Meanwhile, temples continued to evolve. The Temple of Portunus, built around 100 BCE, showed how far Roman architecture had come. It sat on a high podium, as always. But the columns were no longer painted wood. They were stone, carved in the Ionic order, elegant with scroll-like capitals. The walls of the cellar were concrete faced with tufa blocks. This technique, concrete core, decorative stone exterior, would become standard. It was cheaper and faster than solid stone, but looked just as impressive. Inside, the cult statue stood in flickering lamplight. Outside, the steps leading up to the podium were steep, dramatic, forcing visitors to crane their necks upward. Height equaled power, always. But the most striking feature was the preservation. This temple, unlike its wooden predecessors, was built to last. Stone didn't rot. Concrete didn't burn. This wasn't a structure that would need rebuilding every generation. The Romans were thinking in centuries now, building for permanence, creating a city that would outlive its founders. By the end of the 2nd century BCE, Rome had mastered the basics. Stone construction, concrete, arches, vaults, aqueducts, roads stretching across Italy and beyond. But they hadn't yet created their masterpiece, hadn't yet built something that would make the world stop and stare. That was coming. In the next century, as the Republic collapsed and empire rose, Roman architecture would reach heights no one had imagined. They would build domes that seemed to float, amphitheaters that held 50,000 people, bath complexes larger than palaces, structures so massive, so audacious, that even in ruin they would inspire awe for millennia. But tonight, we're still in the age of experimentation, of learning, of slow, careful progress. The concrete is mixed, the arches are rising, the foundation is laid, and Rome, ambitious and ruthless and unstoppable, is about to show the world what architecture can really do. Close your eyes for a moment. Let the timeline shift. It's 49 BCE and Rome is tearing itself apart. Not from outside invasion, not from plague or famine, from ambition. From men who looked at the Republic, this carefully balanced system of shared power, and decided they wanted it all for themselves. Julius Caesar has crossed the Rubicon. Civil war has begun. And in the chaos, in the blood-soaked decades that follow, Roman architecture will transform completely. Because here's the thing about autocrats: they love building. They love monuments. They love seeing their names carved in marble, their faces on coins, their legacies literally set in stone. The Republic built temples to honor gods. The coming emperors will build temples to honor themselves. But we're not there yet. Tonight, we're in the final years of the Republic, watching it crumble while, paradoxically, creating some of the most stunning architecture Rome has ever seen. Let's watch the marble rise as the Republic falls. For centuries, Rome had built primarily with tufa, travertine, and concrete. Functional materials. Practical. Roman. Marble was different. Marble was Greek. It was luxury. It was extravagance. And it was expensive. So expensive that only the wealthiest families could afford to import it from quarries in Greece and Asia Minor. But by the 1st century BCE, Rome was drowning in wealth. Conquered territories sent tribute. Trade routes stretched across the Mediterranean. And suddenly, marble became accessible, not to everyone, but to those who mattered: senators, generals, the political elite. And they wanted to build, to compete, to outdo each other in displays of architectural grandeur. The first major marble temple in Rome was the Temple of Jupiter Stator, rebuilt around 146 BCE using marble columns imported from Greece. It was a statement: Rome has arrived. We're not just conquerors, we're civilized. We're cultured. We're Greek, but better. This started a trend: marble temples, marble colonnades, marble facades covering concrete cores. The city began to gleam white under the Mediterranean sun, reflecting light like a beacon visible for miles. But marble wasn't just about aesthetics. It was political. Building in marble said, I have money. I have taste. I have power. It was conspicuous consumption carved into the cityscape. One man embodied this more than anyone: Pompey the Great. Pompey was a general, a politician, and a showman. He'd conquered vast territories, brought unimaginable wealth to Rome, and wanted everyone to know it. In 55 BCE, he built Rome's first permanent theatre, the Theatre of Pompey. Before this, Roman theatres were temporary wooden structures erected for festivals and torn down afterward. The Senate had banned permanent theatres, seeing them as Greek decadence, places where idleness and immorality bred. Pompey found a loophole. He built a temple, the Temple of Venus Victrix, at the top of the seating area. Technically, the theatre wasn't a theatre. It was the access stairs to a temple that just happened to have seating for 20,000 people facing a massive stage. The structure was revolutionary. A semicircular seating area, the cavea, built from concrete and faced with marble. Arched galleries beneath the seats, creating circulation space and structural support. The stage building, the Scaenae Frons, was 3 stories tall, covered in columns, statues, and decorative niches. This wasn't just architecture. It was theatre about theatre. The building itself performed, presenting a facade of wealth and power before any actor spoke a line. Behind the theatre, Pompey built a massive portico, a covered walkway with gardens, fountains, and art galleries. A place where Romans could stroll between performances, see and be seen, conduct business in the shade. And in the attached meeting hall, the Senate sometimes convened. In fact, it was here, in Pompey's theatre complex, that Julius Caesar would be assassinated in 44 BCE, stabbed 23 times at the base of a statue of Pompey himself. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Rome's most powerful man, murdered in a building designed to celebrate someone else's greatness. Architecture as the stage for history's most famous betrayal. But let's talk about Caesar, because before his assassination, he too was building. Caesar understood something fundamental. Architecture is propaganda. It shapes how people see you, how they remember you, how your legacy endures. He began rebuilding the Forum Romanum, adding new structures, reorganizing space, asserting control over Rome's civic heart. But his most ambitious project was the Forum Julium, a new forum adjacent to the old one, built entirely from scratch. It was smaller than the Forum Romanum, but more organized. A rectangular plaza surrounded by colonnaded porticos. At one end, the Temple of Venus Genitrix, Venus the ancestor, because Caesar claimed descent from the goddess through the hero Aeneas. This wasn't just ego, it was theology. By building a temple to his divine ancestor, Caesar was positioning himself as semi-divine. Not quite a god, not yet, but divinely connected. Special. Chosen. The temple was marble, naturally. Corinthian columns, the most ornate of the Greek orders, supporting a richly decorated entablature. Inside, a statue of Venus. And beside her, a golden statue of Cleopatra, Caesar's lover and Egypt's queen. Rome was scandalized, and fascinated, and terrified. Because this wasn't the architecture of a republican magistrate. This was the architecture of a king. Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE didn't end the trend. It accelerated it. His adopted heir, Octavian, later called Augustus, would take everything Caesar started and multiply it. But we'll get to him. For now, let's stay in the chaos. The civil wars, the triumvirates, the blood-soaked decades where Rome's political class murdered each other while simultaneously building monuments to eternity. Marcus Agrippa, Augustus's right-hand man and Rome's greatest builder, began constructing infrastructure at a scale never before attempted. He repaired and expanded Rome's aqueducts, ensuring clean water for the growing population. He built new bath complexes, offering free bathing to citizens, a political move disguised as public health. And he began surveying the Campus Martius, the Field of Mars, a flat floodplain outside the city walls. This area, once used for military training, would become Rome's greatest architectural playground. But before that transformation could happen, Rome needed stability. It needed peace. It needed an emperor. Let's pause and look at what Roman concrete had become by this point. Engineers had perfected the mix. Pozzolana, lime, water, and aggregate in precise ratios. They knew that adding crushed brick made it stronger. That using lightweight volcanic pumice as aggregate reduced weight without sacrificing strength. They'd learned to pour concrete in layers, allowing each section to partially harden before adding the next. This prevented cracking and created a monolithic structure. They'd discovered that concrete strengthened over time. The chemical reactions continued for years, even decades, binding the material tighter as it aged. And they'd realized something revolutionary. Concrete could be molded into any shape. Curved vaults, domed ceilings, complex geometries impossible with stone. This flexibility was intoxicating. Architects began dreaming bigger. What if we built a dome so large it covered an entire temple? What if we created vaulted ceilings spanning 100 feet with no internal supports? What if we defied gravity itself? These weren't just fantasies. The technology was almost there. All it needed was ambition. And Rome, even in civil war, had ambition to spare. But let's not forget the other side of Roman engineering, military architecture. The same techniques building temples and forums were also building siege weapons and fortifications. Roman military engineers were among the best in the world, and their skills came directly from architectural knowledge. Take the siege tower, a mobile wooden structure, sometimes 100 feet tall, built on site during sieges. It required understanding of load-bearing, structural stability, and materials, the same knowledge used in constructing buildings. Or the battering ram. Protected by a wooden shed reinforced with metal plates, it was essentially architecture turned into a weapon. The engineering that built vaulted roofs also built protective covers that could withstand boiling oil and arrows. Roman siege ramps were even more impressive. During the siege of Masada in 73 CE, Roman engineers built a massive earthen ramp over 375 feet tall, allowing them to roll siege engines up to the fortress walls. This wasn't just military tactics. It was civil engineering applied to warfare. And crucially, Roman soldiers weren't just fighters. They were builders. Every legion included trained engineers, surveyors, and construction workers. They built roads as they marched, erected fortified camps every night, constructed bridges to cross rivers. The same hands that poured concrete for aqueducts also built watchtowers along enemy borders. The same minds that designed bath complexes also designed fortifications that could withstand months-long sieges. Roman architecture wasn't just about beauty or civic pride. It was about control, about projecting power across vast distances, about making Rome's presence permanent, inescapable, eternal. By 31 BCE, the civil wars were ending. Octavian had defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium. Rome's territories were unified under one man's control. Octavian would soon take the name Augustus, and under his rule, Rome would transform from a city of brick into a city of marble. But before we step into that golden age, let's take stock of where we are. Rome has mastered concrete. It can build vaults and arches at scales previously impossible. It has access to marble from across the empire. It has engineering knowledge accumulated over centuries. And it has wealth, staggering, almost incomprehensible wealth, flowing in from every conquered province. The Republic is dead. Long live the Empire. And with the Empire comes architectural ambition unlike anything the world has ever seen. Buildings that seem to float. Spaces that feel infinite. Structures so grand they'll stand for 2,000 years and still inspire awe. The stage is set. The materials are ready. The engineers are waiting, and Augustus, Rome's first emperor, is about to unleash them on the world. But tonight, rest here, in the twilight of the Republic, in a Rome still finding its voice, in a moment before the marble truly takes over, before the emperors build monuments to themselves that dwarf everything that came before. The foundation has been laid, the technology exists, the ambition burns. And Rome, patient and ruthless and unstoppable, is about to build its masterpieces. Let the world settle around you. Take a breath. It's 27 BCE, and everything has changed. Again. Octavian, the young heir who spent years fighting civil wars, crushing rivals, and consolidating power, has just done something clever. He's officially restored the Republic, returned power to the Senate, stepped back from dictatorship. Except he hasn't. Not really. He's kept control of the armies. He's kept the richest provinces. He's kept the loyalty of the people. And the Senate, grateful just to be alive after decades of bloodshed, has given him a new title, Augustus. the revered one. Rome has its first emperor, and he's about to rebuild the entire city. Augustus would later claim, "I found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble." It wasn't quite true. Rome had plenty of marble before him. But the scale of what he did, the sheer ambition of his building program, transformed the city beyond recognition. Tonight, we're watching that transformation. We're seeing how one man's architectural vision created the template for imperial power that would last 4 centuries. Let's begin. Augustus understood something his predecessors hadn't fully grasped. Architecture is eternal propaganda. Military victories fade from memory. Political speeches are forgotten. But buildings remain. They stand as permanent reminders of who built them, who paid for them, who deserves credit for Rome's greatness. So Augustus built constantly, obsessively. He claimed to have restored 82 temples in a single year. Whether that number is accurate doesn't matter. What matters is the message: Augustus is pious. Augustus honors the gods. Augustus cares about Rome's sacred traditions. But he wasn't just restoring, he was creating. His first major project was completing the Forum Julium, Caesar's unfinished forum. But Augustus didn't stop there. He built his own forum, the Forum of Augustus, right next to it. This forum was larger, grander, more carefully planned than anything before it. A rectangular plaza surrounded by colonnades with the Temple of Mars Ultor, Mars the Avenger, dominating one end. The temple commemorated Augustus's victory over Caesar's assassins. It was revenge architecture. A monument to settling scores, carved in Carrara marble, the finest white marble in Italy, quarried from mountains near modern-day Tuscany. The temple's columns were enormous, over 50 feet tall. Corinthian capitals carved with such delicate detail they looked like frozen lace. The pediment, the triangular gable above the columns, was filled with sculptures depicting Mars, Venus, and Romulus, Rome's mythical founder. Inside the temple, statues of Mars and Venus flanked a central statue of the deified Julius Caesar. Because Augustus, clever as always, wasn't just honoring Mars. He was honoring his adopted father, reminding everyone of his divine lineage. The forum's colonnades held statues of Rome's greatest heroes. Generals, kings, legendary figures, all facing toward the temple, all seemingly bowing to Augustus's family. This wasn't just a public space. It was a narrative. A story told in marble about Rome's destiny, with Augustus as its inevitable conclusion. But Augustus didn't just build forums. He transformed the Campus Martius, that flat floodplain north of the city, into Rome's grandest architectural showcase. Remember Marcus Agrippa, Augustus's general and closest friend? He became Rome's master builder. And on the Campus Martius, he created something unprecedented, the Pantheon. Not the Pantheon you might be thinking of. That comes later. This was the first Pantheon, completed around 25 BCE. A traditional rectangular temple dedicated to all the gods. It had a deep porch supported by massive granite columns imported from Egypt, red and grey granite, each column over 40 feet tall and weighing over 60 tons. Transporting them from Egypt to Rome was a logistical nightmare involving specially built ships, hundreds of workers, and sheer determination. The pediment bore an inscription: Marcus Agrippa, son of Lucius, consul for the 3rd time, built this. But everyone knew the truth. Agrippa built it, but Augustus paid for it. Augustus approved it. Augustus's vision shaped it. The original Pantheon was impressive but traditional. A rectangular temple, columned porch, standard design. It wouldn't last. It burned down twice and was eventually completely rebuilt. But for now, in Augustus's reign, it represented something important. Rome's architectural ambitions were expanding beyond the old city centre. Next to the Pantheon, Agrippa built Rome's first great public bath complex. These weren't just bathing rooms. They were massive recreational centres, heated pools, cold plunges, exercise yards, gardens, libraries. And they were free, open to all citizens. This was policy disguised as generosity. Give people luxury and they'll support you. Give them comfort and they'll forgive your autocracy. Let's talk about those baths because they represent a crucial innovation, the hypocaust heating system. Roman baths needed hot water. lots of it, constantly. The solution was ingenious and brutal. Beneath the bath floors, workers built a hollow space, about 2 feet high, supported by hundreds of small brick pillars. Fires burned in furnaces at one end, and hot air flowed through this space, heating the floor above and the rooms. The walls were also hollow, with terracotta tubes stacked vertically, allowing hot air to rise and heat the entire room. But here's what made it work: slave labor. Someone had to tend those fires, day and night, in cramped, suffocating underground chambers where temperatures exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Slaves, usually, working in conditions that slowly killed them. They fed wood into the furnaces, hauled ashes out, breathed smoke-filled air, suffered burns, heat exhaustion, and respiratory disease. The Romans bathing above, relaxing in warm water, enjoying steam, socializing in comfort, never saw them, never thought about them. The machinery of luxury was hidden, deliberately, so patrons could enjoy without guilt. This was Roman engineering, brilliant, effective, and utterly indifferent to human cost. Augustus also rebuilt the Circus Maximus, Rome's oldest and largest chariot racing stadium. The circus had existed for centuries, but Augustus expanded it massively. By the time he finished, it could hold over 150,000 spectators, roughly a quarter of Rome's population, all gathered to watch chariots race around a central spine. The track was over 2,000 feet long. Chariots pulled by 4 horses each, blues, greens, reds, whites, each team with fanatical supporters, thundered around tight turns at speeds that regularly killed drivers and horses. The seating was mostly wooden, built on earth embankments. Dangerous, prone to collapse, but Romans didn't care. They packed in anyway, screaming for their teams, betting fortunes, occasionally rioting when races didn't go their way. At the center of the track, Augustus erected an Egyptian obelisk, a massive granite monument he'd looted from Egypt after defeating Cleopatra. It weighed over 500 tons and stood nearly 80 feet tall. Transporting it from Egypt required building a specialized ship. Erecting it required hundreds of workers, complex pulley systems, and engineering precision. And why? To show that Rome, and Augustus specifically, had conquered Egypt, had claimed its treasures, had made them Roman. The obelisk wasn't just decoration. It was a trophy, architecture as conquest narrative. Now let's talk about Augustus's house. Because for all his public grandeur, his private residence was surprisingly modest. He lived on the Palatine Hill in a relatively small house, by imperial standards. It wasn't a palace. It had rooms for sleeping, dining, working, and receiving guests, but nothing excessive. Why? Because Augustus was crafting an image. He was first citizen, not king. He lived simply, he claimed, like any wealthy Roman. He wore plain togas. He ate modest meals. He was one of you. It was all performance. Calculated modesty designed to make autocracy palatable. But his house did have one extraordinary feature: walls covered in frescoes. Not just any frescoes, elaborate painted illusions that made rooms appear larger, walls seemed to open onto gardens, architecture that wasn't there seemed real. This was the second style of Roman wall painting, architectural illusion. Columns painted to look three-dimensional, windows that seemed to look out onto imaginary landscapes, entire fantasy spaces created with pigment and perspective. Roman painters had mastered perspective, not perfectly, not with mathematical precision like Renaissance artists would, but well enough to fool the eye, to make small rooms feel grand, to turn walls into portals. Augustus's house might have been modest in size, but its painted walls created infinite space. Reality and illusion blurred. Just like his politics. Marble. Let's return to marble. Because under Augustus, it became Rome's defining material. The Carrara quarries were fully operational now, producing white marble prized for its purity and fine grain. Ships hauled blocks down to the coast, then across the Mediterranean to Rome's port at Ostia, then up the Tiber on barges. Marble workers, mostly Greek craftsmen, since Romans still considered sculpture beneath them, carved the blocks into columns, capitals, decorative friezes, and statues. The city gleamed. White temples, white colonnades, white statues lining every public space. Under the Mediterranean sun, Rome shone like a vision from the gods. But marble was soft. It stained. It weathered. And in Rome's climate, wet winters, hot summers, it required constant maintenance. So an entire industry grew around marble preservation. Workers cleaned facades, replaced damaged sections, polished surfaces. The gleaming white city was maintained by armies of labourers, making sure the illusion of perfection never cracked. And when marble statues were damaged, they were often patched with cheaper stone, painted to match, and no one was supposed to notice. Rome's marble magnificence wasn't quite as magnificent as it appeared, but from a distance, with the right lighting, it looked like heaven on earth. Augustus died in 14 CE, having ruled for over 40 years. He left behind a city transformed, a Rome that was cleaner, grander, more organized than it had ever been. He'd built temples, forums, aqueducts, roads, and monuments. He'd employed thousands of workers. He'd commissioned countless artists and engineers. He'd made architecture central to imperial identity, and he'd established a pattern. Every emperor who followed would build, would add their name to the city, would try to outdo their predecessors. Some would succeed spectacularly, others would create disasters, but all would build because Augustus had shown them architecture is how emperors are remembered. The Republic built for the gods, the Empire built for immortality, and in that shift, Roman architecture reached heights that seemed impossible. That defied logic. That still, 2,000 years later, leave us staring upward, wondering how, but tonight, rest here. In Augustus's Rome, in a city of marble and ambition, in the moment when empire truly began. The concrete is perfected, the marble is flowing, the engineers are ready, and Rome, patient and ambitious and utterly convinced of its own greatness, is about to build structures that will define Western architecture for the next 2 millennia. The Colosseum is coming. The Pantheon's dome is coming. Bath complexes the size of small cities are coming. But for now, let the marble gleam in your mind. Let the image of Augustus's Rome settle. A city rebuilt, an empire born, and architecture transformed into something eternal. Settle in. Let the silence wrap around you. We're jumping forward. Past Tiberius, the paranoid emperor who barely built anything. Past Caligula, whose architectural plans were as insane as he was. Past Claudius, who focused on infrastructure rather than monuments. Past Nero, who built a golden palace so obscene it had to be buried. It's 70 CE. The Flavian dynasty has just seized power. Vespasian, a general from a relatively humble background, has stabilized Rome after yet another civil war, and he needs to win the people's support. His solution? Give them the greatest entertainment venue the world has ever seen. Tonight, we're watching the construction of the Flavian amphitheater. You know it by another name, the Colosseum. This isn't just a building. It's the ultimate expression of Roman engineering. Concrete and stone working together. Arches stacked to impossible heights. Systems of corridors, elevators, and trapdoors creating a machine for spectacle. And it was built on suffering, constructed with the labor of Jewish slaves captured after the siege of Jerusalem, funded with plundered temple treasures, dedicated with games that killed thousands. Let's see how they built it. The site was deliberate. Nero's Golden House, his sprawling palace complex that had consumed massive portions of central Rome, included an artificial lake. After Nero's forced suicide and the civil war that followed, Vespasian drained that lake and announced, "Where Nero took for himself, I will give to the people." The symbolism was perfect. The new emperor erasing the old emperor's excess. Private indulgence becoming public entertainment. But building on a drained lakebed presented problems. The ground was waterlogged, unstable, prone to settling. Engineers had to dig deep, over 40 feet in places, to reach stable soil and bedrock. They excavated a massive oval pit, roughly 620 feet long and 510 feet wide. Slaves hauled out tons of mud and clay. Then they began building the foundation, concrete poured in layers, creating a solid base over 40 feet deep in the center. This wasn't ordinary concrete. They used a specific mix: pozzolana from nearby deposits, lime, water, and aggregate of broken brick and tufa. The foundation alone required thousands of tons of material. And it had to include drainage. The engineers carved channels through the foundation connecting to Rome's sewer system. Any water seeping up from below would be carried away, preventing the structure from becoming waterlogged. The foundation took months, perhaps a year. Thousands of workers laboring in a muddy pit, mixing concrete, pouring it into wooden forms, waiting for it to harden before adding the next layer. Many didn't survive. Cave-ins buried workers alive. Falls from scaffolding killed others. Disease spread in the cramped, wet conditions. But the work continued. Always. Once the foundation was complete, construction began on the outer wall. And this is where Roman engineering became art. The Colosseum's outer wall is 4 stories tall, rising over 150 feet. It's built from travertine, a cream-coloured limestone quarried from Tivoli, about 20 miles from Rome. Each travertine block weighed several tons. They were cut at the quarry, roughly shaped, then transported to Rome on ox-drawn carts. Thousands of blocks. Hundreds of shipments. A continuous supply line that had to function flawlessly for years. At the construction site, workers hoisted the blocks using cranes, wooden structures powered by tread wheels. Slaves walked inside giant wheels, like hamsters, providing the energy to lift multi-ton stones. The blocks weren't mortared together. Instead, they were held in place by iron clamps, U-shaped metal pieces set into carved slots, holding adjacent blocks together. Over 300 tons of iron were used just for these clamps, each one forged by hand. Each one fitted precisely. If you look at the Colosseum today, you'll see holes where the clamps used to be. Medieval scavengers pried them out, melting them down for tools and weapons. The holes remain, scars of later poverty picking at imperial grandeur. The wall's design is genius. 4 stories, each with a different architectural order stacked on top of each other. Ground level, Doric columns. Or rather, Doric half columns, columns attached to the wall, purely decorative, not structural. Simple, sturdy, conveying strength. Second level, Ionic half columns. More elegant, with scroll-like capitals. Third level, Corinthian half columns. The most ornate, with capitals carved like clusters of acanthus leaves. Fourth level, Corinthian pilasters, flat rectangular columns projecting slightly from the wall. This stacking of orders, called the Colossal Order, became a template copied across Europe for 2,000 years. Renaissance architects studied it. Neoclassical buildings mimicked it. Even modern stadiums echo its rhythm. But here's what's crucial. Those columns aren't holding anything up. The real structure is behind them. The wall is actually a series of concrete and brick arches, radiating outward from the arena floor like spokes on a wheel. The decorative stone facade is just that, a facade. A beautiful mask covering the brutal efficiency of concrete engineering underneath. The Romans had learned to separate structure from decoration, to build functionally, then dress it up. This was revolutionary, and it freed architects to imagine forms that didn't have to follow structural logic. Let's step inside, because the interior is even more impressive than the exterior. The Colosseum could hold between 50,000 and 80,000 spectators, depending on how tightly they packed. All those people had to enter, find their seats, and exit without crushing each other. The solution? The vomitorium system. Not what you're thinking. Romans didn't vomit in special rooms. Vomitoria were passages, corridors that spewed forth crowds. The Colosseum had 80 ground-level entrances. Spectators entered through numbered arches, each leading to a specific section of seating. Staircases and sloped corridors guided them upward to their designated areas. The entire structure was honeycombed with these passages, over 160 staircases total, corridors curving around the interior, ramps sloping gently enough that crowds could move quickly without bottlenecking. This system could fill the entire amphitheater in 15 minutes. And empty it in 5. Think about that. A building seating more people than most modern concert venues, using only passive crowd flow, no electronic signs, no PA systems, just architectural logic, could evacuate faster than most modern stadiums. The seating was hierarchical, naturally. The best seats, marble benches at ground level, were reserved for senators and wealthy citizens. Above them, the equestrian class. Above them, common citizens. At the very top, standing room for the poor, slaves, and women. Your social status determined your view. Architecture as class system made visible. Now let's talk about the arena floor itself. Because what spectators saw was illusion. Below it was machinery. The floor was wooden, covered with sand. Arena means sand in Latin, to absorb blood. But that floor wasn't solid. It was a platform covering a vast underground complex called the hypogeum. 2 levels of subterranean corridors ran beneath the arena. These held cages for animals, lions, bears, elephants, exotic creatures shipped from across the empire. Holding cells for gladiators awaiting their turn, storage for props, weapons, and scenery. And elevators. 32 vertical shafts with platforms that could be raised to arena level using a system of pulleys, counterweights, and human power. During shows, trapdoors in the arena floor would open. Platforms would rise, revealing wild animals, gladiators, or elaborate set pieces. To spectators, it seemed like magic. Creatures appearing from nowhere, scenery materializing instantly. But below, in the hypogeum, it was chaos. Slaves operating the machinery, animal handlers controlling terrified beasts. Stagehands moving props, all in narrow corridors lit by oil lamps filled with the roar of animals and the screams of men about to die. The Colosseum wasn't just a building. It was a machine, a theatrical device designed to produce spectacle, wonder, and death on an industrial scale. Let's talk about what happened in the arena. Because architecture shapes behavior, and this architecture was designed for killing. Gladiatorial combat, obviously. Trained fighters facing each other with swords, nets, tridents. Some fights to the death, others to submission. Crowds shouting, betting, demanding blood. Animal hunts, venaciones, where hunters faced lions, tigers, bears, sometimes elephants or rhinoceroses. Exotic animals transported thousands of miles just to be slaughtered for entertainment. Public executions, criminals fed to animals, crucified, burned alive. Justice as spectacle, punishment as entertainment. Mock naval battles, naumachia, where the arena was flooded several feet deep and small ships fought. Though most naumachia happened in other venues, the Colosseum's flooding capacity shows just how adaptable its engineering was. The opening games, held in 80 CE under Emperor Titus, lasted 100 days. Contemporary sources claim 5,000 animals were killed. Hundreds of gladiators died. The sand had to be replaced constantly because it became so soaked with blood it turned to mud. This was Roman entertainment. This was what the greatest architectural achievement of the Flavian dynasty was built to facilitate. But let's look at the engineering innovations that made this possible. The concrete vaulting in the corridors beneath the seating used a technique called opus cementicium, concrete poured over temporary wooden formwork in complex curved shapes. The vaults were barrel vaults, continuous arched ceilings, and groin vaults where 2 barrel vaults intersected. This created a self-supporting structure that distributed weight efficiently, allowing for open corridors without internal columns. The seating cavea, the bowl of seats, was built on a series of radial walls and arches, all concrete and brick, creating both structure and circulation space simultaneously. The outer wall's arches transferred weight downward and outward to massive foundation piers. Each arch reduced the amount of material needed while maintaining strength. This was pure engineering efficiency. Every element served multiple purposes. Structure became circulation. Load-bearing became aesthetic. Form and function merged completely. And it was all built in less than 10 years. From groundbreaking to opening games, a structure this massive, this complex, this innovative, completed in roughly 8 to 9 years. Modern stadiums take longer. With cranes, computers, and power tools, we build slower than Romans with slaves and determination. The Colosseum's completion under Titus in 80 CE established a new standard. Every city in the empire wanted an amphitheater now. Smaller versions sprouted across Roman territories, from Britain to North Africa, from Spain to Syria. But none matched Rome's, none could. Because the Colosseum wasn't just about size or engineering. It was about imperial power made manifest. A structure that said, Rome can build anything. Rome can destroy anything. And Rome can make you cheer while it happens. The games continued for centuries. The last recorded gladiatorial combat was in 435 CE. The last animal hunts in 523 CE. By then, Christianity had reshaped Roman values. Killing for entertainment was no longer acceptable. The Colosseum fell into disrepair. Earthquakes damaged it. Stone was looted for other buildings. The arena became a dumping ground, then a quarry. But it never disappeared. It was too massive, too solid, too fundamentally Roman to erase. Today, missing its flaws, its machinery exposed like anatomical dissection, it still dominates Rome's skyline, still draws millions of visitors, still whispers stories of engineering genius and human cruelty. So tonight, let that image settle. The Colosseum rising from Nero's drained lake. Travertine blocks stacked 4 stories high. Concrete corridors honeycombing the interior. Machinery below, spectacle above, and 50,000 Romans screaming for blood. This was Roman architecture at its peak. Not beautiful, necessarily. Not humane, but undeniably powerful. They'd mastered concrete, perfected the arch, learned to build at scales that seemed impossible. And they'd turned all that knowledge toward creating the greatest entertainment venue the world had ever seen. But we're not done yet. Because the Colosseum, massive as it is, isn't Rome's greatest architectural achievement. That honor belongs to a building with a dome so large, so perfectly engineered, that even today we're not entirely sure how they built it. But that's ahead of us. For now, rest here, in the shadow of the Colosseum, in the machine of death and spectacle, in the monument to empire at its most brutal and brilliant. Let your breathing slow. Feel the weight of time passing. We've skipped forward again. Past Domitian, who finished the Colosseum and built a massive palace on the Palatine Hill. Past Trajan, who built the greatest forum Rome would ever see, with a column so tall it still punctures the Roman skyline today. It's 118 CE, a new emperor has just taken power. His name is Hadrian. He's different from his predecessors. Cultured, intellectual, obsessed with Greek philosophy and architecture. He has a beard, scandalous for a Roman emperor, but he doesn't care. He wears Greek clothing, he writes poetry, and he has plans. Plans to build something no one has ever built before. A temple with a dome so large, so perfectly proportioned, so impossibly thin that engineers 2,000 years later still study it, trying to understand how. Tonight, we're watching the construction of the Pantheon. The building with the largest unreinforced concrete dome ever built. A structure that has stood for nearly 1,100 years without major repair. A space so perfectly designed that standing inside it feels like stepping into geometry itself. This is Roman architecture's masterpiece. Let's see how they did it. The site already had a temple. Remember Agrippa's Pantheon from Augustus's reign. It had burned down. Twice. The second time in 110 CE under Trajan. Hadrian decided to rebuild it completely, but he kept Agrippa's inscription on the facade. Marcus Agrippa, son of Lucius, consul for the 3rd time, built this, even though the new structure was entirely Hadrian's vision. Why? Politics? Modesty, or the appearance of it. Hadrian wanted to seem like he was restoring Rome's glory, not claiming it for himself. Though everyone knew the truth. The new Pantheon would be revolutionary. Not a traditional rectangular temple, but something unprecedented, a perfect sphere inscribed within a cylinder, topped with the largest dome the world had ever seen. The mathematics were precise. The interior height from floor to oculus, the circular opening at the dome's peak, would be exactly equal to the diameter, 142 feet. A perfect hemisphere of space. This wasn't accident. This was sacred geometry. The sphere represented the heavens, the cosmos, divine perfection. Standing inside, you'd be at the center of the universe, equidistant from all points on the dome above. Hadrian was building theology in concrete. Construction began around 118 CE and took roughly 10 years. The foundation alone was massive, a concrete ring over 24 feet thick and 26 feet deep, creating a stable base for the enormous weight above. The walls were built from brick-faced concrete, rising cylindrical around the interior space. But these weren't solid walls. They were honeycomb with recesses, niches, and chambers, both to reduce weight and to create visual rhythm. 8 massive piers, thick sections of wall, bore the dome's weight. Between them, alternating rectangular and curved niches created a rhythm of solid and void. The walls were over 20 feet thick at the base, gradually thinning as they rose. But the real challenge was the dome itself. A dome is fundamentally different from a vault. A vault's weight pushes down and outward in 2 directions. A dome pushes down and outward in all directions simultaneously, creating enormous lateral thrust, forces trying to push the walls outward and collapse the structure. The solution required precise engineering, careful material selection, and techniques that wouldn't be fully understood until modern structural analysis. The dome was built using a massive wooden formwork, a temporary structure shaped like the interior of the dome, supporting the concrete as it hardened. This formwork was a masterpiece of carpentry. Thousands of boards shaped and assembled into a perfect hemisphere, supported by an elaborate scaffolding system rising from the floor. Once the formwork was complete, workers began pouring the concrete. But not all at once. The dome was built in horizontal rings, starting at the base and working upward. Each ring had to partially harden before the next was added, preventing the weight from overwhelming the formwork. The process took months, perhaps over a year just for the dome itself. And here's where Roman engineering becomes genius. They changed the concrete recipe as they built upward. At the base, where the dome was thickest, nearly 20 feet, they used heavy aggregate, travertine and brick fragments. This provided strength to resist the enormous compressive forces. As they moved higher, they switched to lighter aggregate, tufa, then volcanic pumice. The dome gradually became less dense, reducing the total weight bearing down on the structure. At the very top, around the oculus, they used primarily pumice, so light it could float in water. The dome's crown was almost foam-like compared to its heavy base. This gradient of density, heavy at the bottom, light at the top, was crucial. It reduced the dome's total weight by roughly 30% compared to using uniform concrete throughout. But there's more. The dome isn't smooth inside. It's divided into 5 rings of 28 coffers each, recessed square panels that create a waffle-like pattern. These coffers aren't just decorative. They reduce weight further, removing concrete from areas where it isn't structurally necessary. Each coffer is deeper at the bottom of the dome and shallower near the top, gradually transitioning until they disappear into the smooth concrete around the oculus. The mathematics are perfect. The coffers align precisely. Their dimensions create visual perspective that makes the dome appear even larger than it is. And they had to be built into the formwork before concrete was poured. Wooden molds, coffers carved in reverse, protruding downward from the formwork surface. The concrete was poured around them, creating the recessed panels. Once the concrete hardened, and it took months, setting slowly, gaining strength gradually, the formwork was removed. Workers dismantled the scaffolding, pulled out the wooden supports, and lowered the coffer molds. And the dome stood, self-supporting, permanent. Impossible. Let's talk about the oculus. Because this opening, 30 feet in diameter at the dome's peak, seems like a structural flaw. Why create a massive hole in the center of your dome? First, it reduces weight at the dome's crown, where lateral forces are greatest. Less weight means less outward thrust. Second, it illuminates the interior. Sunlight streams through the oculus, moving across the interior as the sun travels across the sky. The Pantheon becomes a sundial, tracking time with shadow and light. Third, it's symbolic. The oculus is the eye, the connection between earthly and divine. Through it, you see the sky, the heavens, the realm of the gods. But practically, it creates problems. Rain falls through it. Snow in winter. The floor had to be slightly domed and fitted with drainage holes to channel water away. Romans visiting the Pantheon on rainy days watched water pour through the oculus, splash onto the marble floor, and drain away through hidden channels. It was theatrical. proof that even in a sacred space, the elements intruded. The oculus's edge is lined with bronze, one of the few original metal elements remaining. Bronze tiles originally covered the entire exterior dome, gleaming like gold under the Mediterranean sun. Medieval popes stripped most of it, melting it down for cannons and statues. But the oculus bronze remains, a reminder of what the entire dome once looked like. The interior is breathtaking. The dome soars overhead, seeming to float despite its immense weight. The coffers create rhythm and depth. The oculus floods the space with light. The walls are faced with coloured marble, panels of yellow, purple, red and green imported from across the empire. Egyptian porphyry, Greek marble, African granite. The Pantheon is a museum of imperial conquest rendered in stone. 7 niches line the interior, originally holding statues of gods. The Pantheon, temple to all gods, honoured the entire Roman pantheon simultaneously. Mars, Venus, Jupiter, all present, all equal, or perhaps not gods at all. Some scholars think the Pantheon honoured the 7 classical planets: Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, the cosmic bodies that governed Roman astrology and timekeeping. Either way, the space feels sacred. The perfect proportions create a sense of harmony, balance, rightness. You stand at the centre of a sphere, equidistant from all points, and feel simultaneously small and central. The acoustics are remarkable. A whisper at one point can be heard clearly across the room. Sound reflects off the curved dome, focusing and amplifying. Priests performing rituals could speak normally and be heard by hundreds. This wasn't accident. This was architectural acoustics, understood intuitively, if not scientifically. The Pantheon's dome remained the largest in the world for over 300 years. Not until Brunelleschi's dome in Florence, completed in 1436, would anything approach its size. And crucially, Brunelleschi studied the Pantheon. Renaissance architects made pilgrimages to Rome specifically to measure it, sketch it, understand it. The Pantheon became the teacher of generations. Michelangelo called it angelic and not human design. He meant it as compliment, but also truth. The engineering was so advanced, so perfectly executed, that it seemed beyond mortal capability. Modern engineers, using computer analysis, have confirmed what Roman builders knew intuitively: the dome is perfectly optimized. The thickness, the material gradient, the coffer placement all create a structure that efficiently channels forces, minimizing stress concentrations. Change almost anything, and it gets worse. Make it thicker, and unnecessary weight increases lateral thrust. Make it thinner, and it risks collapse. Use uniform concrete, and weight increases dangerously. The Pantheon isn't just good engineering. It's optimal engineering. Built without computers, without steel reinforcement, without modern materials. Just concrete, careful planning, and deep understanding of structural behavior. But let's not romanticize too much. Because building the Pantheon required suffering. The wooden formwork alone required forests of timber. Trees felled, transported, shaped, assembled. The labour was backbreaking and dangerous. Workers hauling concrete up scaffolding slipped and fell. Scaffolding collapsed under weight. The formwork, supporting hundreds of tons of wet concrete, occasionally failed catastrophically, crushing anyone below. The concrete had to be mixed continuously for months. Slaves worked in rotating shifts, grinding pozzolana, mixing lime, hauling aggregate, pouring the endless grey mass into forms. Lime burns skin, pozzolana dust damages lungs. Heavy lifting destroys backs and joints. Many workers who started the Pantheon didn't live to see it completed. And all this suffering, all these deaths, went unrecorded. We know the architect's name, probably Apollodorus of Damascus, though some dispute this. We know Hadrian commissioned it. But the thousands who built it? Nameless. Forgotten. The Pantheon stands as testament to Roman genius, but also to Roman ruthlessness. Beauty built on bones. The Pantheon survived because it was converted into a church in 609 CE. The Christian church claimed it, reconsecrating it as Santa Maria ad Martires. This saved it from the destruction that befell most pagan temples. While others were stripped for materials or deliberately demolished, the Pantheon remained functional, maintained, protected. Ironic that Rome's greatest pagan temple survived by becoming Christian. The gods were evicted, replaced by saints and martyrs. But the architecture remained unchanged. Today, it's still a functioning church, still holding services, still open to visitors who stand beneath the dome, staring upward, trying to comprehend how Romans built this without steel, without cranes, without anything we'd consider modern technology. The answer is knowledge. Deep, accumulated, carefully preserved knowledge of materials, geometry, and structural behavior. Knowledge gained through centuries of experimentation, failure, and incremental improvement. The Pantheon wasn't the first dome Romans built. It was the culmination of hundreds of earlier attempts, smaller domes in bath complexes, temples, villas. Each one teaching lessons, each failure revealing limits, each success pushing boundaries. By the time they built the Pantheon, Roman engineers knew exactly what they were doing. They'd solved the problem through practice, not theory. Through building, not calculating. So tonight, let that image rest in your mind. The Pantheon's dome curving overhead, light streaming through the oculus, the perfect sphere of space enveloping you. This was Roman architecture at its absolute peak. Not just big is easy, but big and beautiful and perfectly proportioned and still standing after 1,900 years. They'd taken concrete, that humble mixture of volcanic ash, lime, and water, and used it to create something that seems to defy gravity itself. The dome floats. Mathematically, structurally, it shouldn't, but it does. Because Roman engineers understood forces intuitively, worked with materials masterfully, and refused to accept that anything was impossible. This is the legacy, not just buildings, but ambition. The belief that if you understand the principles, gather the resources, and commit fully, you can build anything. The Pantheon proves it. Still standing, still perfect, still impossible, and still teaching us that sometimes the ancients knew things we're only beginning to relearn.